Hey everyone, thanks for giving us a little bit of a break here to catch up, and welcome back. I have the great pleasure to introduce our next panel. This segment is called Free Fall or Free for All. Really looking forward to discussion here on some of the decisions we all need to make as individuals, as organizations, where our values lie, and we up next on this, we've got Christopher Jeffrey, a protocol developer and early contributor to Handshake, Greg Osuri, founder of Akash, previous guest on the Priv8 podcast, Tor Bair, founder of Secret Network, also a past guest on the Priv8 podcast, Ari Paul, CIO and co-founder of Block Tower, and this is going to be moderated and hosted by Benjamin Powers, the technology journalist. Benjamin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Derek. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, thanks. It was a great morning and early afternoon of sessions. Ayla, Lee, Glenn Greenwald, of course, and then this most recent discussion between Zach and Shiv was invigorating. So hopefully we can keep the ball rolling here and have. I think we're gonna have a really good substantive discussion here with this panel. I'll hand things off to you and take it away.
No, absolutely. Well, welcome back to Priv8. My name is Benjamin Powers. I'm a technology reporter at a new media startup launching early next year. And previously, I was the privacy reporter at CoinDesk. So I just want to welcome in our panelists to the session and give them a bit of a chance to introduce themselves. We're going to be unpacking a lot of different things in this session, but overall, generally looking at the economic incentives and how they align with privacy, how they don't, and the way that privacy is being built in or not to the future that we're all kind of building here together. So Greg, I just want to go around the room, but give you a chance to introduce yourself, and then we can have everybody else jump in.
My name is Greg Osuri. I'm the founder for Akash Network, programmer for a little over 25 years, and built Akash really to democratize cloud computing, really transfer the power from the what seemed to be oligopolized infrastructure players to really a more democratized and owned by the user, right? So as we know today, most the cloud computing market is really controlled by 4 players that the effects of which go beyond just cost. It's really comes down to the whole topic of this conversation as to what happens when few really control the many. So I'm really excited to be on this panel.
No, absolutely. Thanks for being here. And Ari, let's have you up next.
Sure. So I'm non-technical and probably the least knowledgeable person participating in this conference around the technical topics. I'm an investor and trader, and I'm co-founder of Block Tower Capital. We're a crypto asset management firm. So my perspective on this is much more from the economic side, and then also on the humanitarian side, which was part of why I got into crypto in the first place.
Great. Thank you so much. And Christopher?
Hi, my name is Chris Jeffrey, but most people call me JJ. I got started in cryptocurrency by working on Bitcoin and re-implementing Bitcoin. I'm the author of an alternative Bitcoin implementation called Bcoin, which is the only other implementation, I think still today, aside from Satoshi's original code, which actually mined a block on Bitcoin mainnet. So after doing that, using the skills I learned re-implementing Bitcoin, I was an early contributor to a protocol called Handshake, which is a decentralized naming protocol. And I also still work on other protocol things like Bitcoin. I just released a new re-implementation of Bitcoin entirely written in C, which is called Mako, and that will eventually be used as the basis for another port to Handshake. So Handshake will have 2 full nodes. So yeah, basically I'm a protocol developer, I'm an implementer, and that's my main focus. That's what I'm obsessed with.
Very, very cool. I'm glad we got both sides of the spectrum here in terms of talking through all this. And obviously, last but not least, Tor.
Yeah, I kind of sit squarely in the middle of that spectrum somewhere, or maybe in some tertiary field that's certainly not more valuable than
some
either
side
of
chains.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm Tor. I'm the founder of Secret Foundation. I've been working full-time on the Secret Network ecosystem for going on 4.5 years now. And Secret is the first L1 to implement private smart contracts on mainnet. We're going on our 2nd year now of having private smart contracts in production. I speak a lot publicly on the value of privacy in Web3 systems as well as in Web2 systems. Occasionally, I express some excitement that we're moving in the right direction in both worlds. More often, I express doom, and I let people know that they shouldn't take these things for granted, that if we don't think very hard about it and work very hard to implement it, like Ben is probably going to allude to, these things don't just solve themselves. There's a lot of UX challenges with privacy, cost challenges with privacy, but what we're trying to protect is more valuable than the costs at achieving it. So that's where I do a lot of my talking publicly, but I really do enjoy building products that use privacy at their core to enable new use cases for end users, with the goal of getting millions of users around the world using Web3 tech that have privacy at their core.
No, absolutely. And so I want to jump off something you were talking about there, which is just that value proposition, right? I think that's really important. And I think it's also something that maybe gets a little bit under discussed in my privacy reporting and a number of other areas, as you alluded to. Sometimes more private systems are a little bit clunkier, the UI is a little bit harder. There's not necessarily that obvious kind of like market value to it when you think about adaptation, right? People quite often really just like things to be as easy as possible and as frictionless as possible. And so, Ari, I want to toss this one to you initially and kind of think through, what are the economics of privacy? You know, who gains from more private system and technology, and who loses, speaking particularly to your background as an investor, for example?
Yeah, well, I think as everyone at this point is super aware, most of the biggest companies in the world make their money off advertising, which is really off collecting data and then targeted advertising. And that's really a pretty new thing. So the idea of monetizing content and traffic all through this idea of targeted advertising depending on data was really a post-90s, thing. I think part of the reason that happened was because we couldn't do micropayments. So if you're facing, like, if you're the New York Times, you couldn't charge a fraction of a cent for an article, so you had to monetize in other ways. Let's see. So obviously all those big players in the current economic models lose badly to privacy, although I think they're already skating, they recognize that. And it's funny that regulation is actually a friend of privacy to some degree, in that European privacy laws are really forcing all of the social media giants to treat their data very differently. So companies like Meta are now moving more into hardware, I think, because they recognize this kind of data-driven monetization is not going to be quite the driver it used to be. Let me try to end with a salient point. I think regulators are going to force something like selective disclosure of data built into the systems. So what I mean by that is, for example, with medical records, you're required to disclose it to certain government agencies. You want to disclose it to your doctor, and you want those medical records to be easily transferable, but it's illegal to disclose it beyond that. So having the data kind of contain that ability to permission it, I think is actually going to be forced on the world by regulators, by legislators, and hopefully there's at least a good side to that.
Yeah, and Tor, kind of coming back to what you were talking about in terms of, I know the Secret Network does a lot of stuff. It has its own tokens and everything else. So what do you see as the value proposition here from your end in terms of it being attractive for, larger markets and stuff like that?
Yeah, I want to extend Ari's point, which is, how did we get here, right? There's definitely a lot of thinking that says if we had had the technical capabilities to build something better, it's what would have been adopted. We didn't, so it wasn't. And now Web2 companies expend a lot of economic and regulatory energy trying to ensure that those systems become sustainable. But by their nature, they're unsustainable systems. I just gave a talk about this in Lisbon, where I put the quote up on the wall behind me, the quote that people might know that says, "Information wants to be free." But that's not the whole quote. The whole quote is actually, information wants to be free, but it also wants to be expensive because it's so valuable. It is the people who want to be free. And that's the tension that's been at the heart of Web2 this whole time. Like, information's been super cheap to collect, but it's super valuable to have. You can monetize it. You can turn it into an entire platform strategy that lets you take over the world and then rebrand as Meta. That's been the whole strategy. And it looks like they figured out phase 3 after profit. And, what I'm thinking in the Web3 world is, now that we have some of what Ari is describing as a better potential world for micropayments or payments of any kind to creators, we can only have those systems if those systems are not public by default. Now, public by default Web3 just means we're going to fall back into the same extractive patterns of Web2, where people take that super cheap information, repackage it, re-centralize it, re-monetize the user base. The only way creators and users are ultimately going to win is if these are private by default systems that do give users control. And as Ari was also saying in his last salient point, which is also mine, I do think regulators will actually help us achieve that outcome if they can understand what it is that we're trying to achieve with privacy in Web3. They're going to see exactly how, by combining permissionless systems with private by default systems, we can give users control and choice and let them take the upside in these systems rather than re-centralizing them in these giant monoliths that become threats to democracy.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is too, unfortunately, people do like those monoliths in a variety of different ways. But Chris, I'm curious to get your perspective from the technical side on this in terms of when you're developing protocols, when you're thinking about this. You know, I mentioned private by design earlier, but are you thinking about larger market adoption or usage, or are you really just kind of focusing on the nitty gritty in terms of making things, you know, more salient, more redundant, you know, really kind of focusing on that Web3 aspect?
Well, both. I mean, I think there's multiple concepts here. It's not just privacy. It's decentralization. It's anti-censorship, and it's privacy. And there's overlap between all three of those. The one I'm most worried about, I think, is decentralization. Just because over time things tend to get more centralized. And we can see this, right? Before Twitter, there was RSS. I remember in the 2000s, I would open my Google Reader every morning, and there was about 100 blogs I was subscribed to, and I never understood the appeal of Twitter because I was just like, well, this is just centralized RSS and a bunch of hype. You know, before Reddit, there was like news groups and Usenet and I don't know, and you know, there's BBSs, there was message boards, there's forums, there were all these like cool little corners of the internet, and it feels like the internet's gotten smaller over time. And I think this is just sort of like a fundamental pattern to life, is that over time things get more centralized, and that's a really sad statement. And it's not really obvious how to push back against that and try to revert back to the way things were. So the way I see it, when I'm developing protocols that are intended to be decentralized, all I'm doing is trying to get us back, you know, 20, 30 years in the past when things were decentralized. And in effect, they were more private too. DNS is another example. You know, like people used to pass around like a host file, and there was no centralized root zone. But yeah, decentralization. I think there's sort of we have like our own internal battle inside crypto too. It's not just the whole internet. I think there's sort of like a culture problem inside crypto. Just in the cryptocurrency community, where there's a whole lot of people involved with cryptocurrency that are involved with it for the wrong reasons. And so you have to like sort of push back against those people too, and be like, well, wait, no, like this thing is way too centralized. And I feel like most people just aren't sensitive to that thing. So it's not like they're bad people or anything. I just don't think they're as sensitive to others about privacy or decentralization or anti-censorship. I think, you know, most people, ordinary people who just use computers like your average Joe, like they're not thinking about privacy. So, and we've seen this, right? Like after I mean, Glenn Greenwald was here after the Snowden leaks dropped. I actually don't remember when it was. It was a long time ago, but I remember it happening, and I was like, oh, this is going to change everything. People are finally going to wake up to the fact that they're being spied on, and that privacy is actually important. And then nothing happened. Like most people just didn't care. So I don't know. There's a lot of issues here. There's a lot of little battles, and there's a lot of. It's hard. It's not obvious how to figure out how to get people to adopt these things. I mean, there's problems with decentralization and privacy, and it's not obvious how to solve them. Sorry, I ran.
No, I think No, absolutely. I think that these questions were easy. They'd be answered already. And that's kind of why we're talking about this. And I think maybe to your point, we saw this with the explosion of interest around NFTs too, where people are just kind of rushing into the marketplaces. They're buying on centralized platforms. I know, for example, when I reported on an instance, back in the day, when I say back in the day, I mean earlier this year, where a platform was able to just like revert NFT ownership to the original owners after, they had their accounts hacked because the hacker didn't take them off platform. And so the layers of centralization or decentralization and what people think they need is really interesting because, I do think that there are people who look at these things, say, this is terrible, I don't like this, and then log back onto Facebook, for example, or something else like that. But Greg, I want to get your thoughts on this one. We're thinking about how to incentivize people to use more private stuff or just the marketplace for privacy more generally. What are your thoughts on that?
My fellow panelists have brought very important and very clear points. I think the word we can put to what's happening with the Web 2, the monetization, the most lucrative monetization mechanism happens to be the surveillance capitalism, right? Like this is the modern day, the way I would define surveillance capitalism is a modern day business model where everything we do is tracked and analyzed and monetized, right? And this is a fairly new phenomenon. This didn't really exist 10 years ago. The really result is Google really knows more than when you're pregnant, right? Like Facebook knows when you have a period. My Fitbit knows when I'm having sex. That's a kind of world we live in. And how did we end up here is I think we traded convenience for privacy without even realizing what we are trading for. And we traded user experience for privacy, right? And there's absolutely, the area you hit the nail on the head. The area really that got people here is the user experience. And how do we solve this? I believe through decentralization. Well, Tor has a point of privacy first, but I think really if you put privacy first, that is inherently dangerous for decentralization. I wouldn't say dangerous, but that goes against the open system policy or the phenomenon, right? So when you have systems that are open, that leads to more participation, that leads to more innovation. So I really don't know what the answer is. Do we do privacy first, or do we do decentralization first, or can we do both? And if you do both, how the user experience is going to look like? A lot of unanswered questions, to be honest with you.
Yeah, definitely. Can you pull at that thread a little bit more for me about the decentralization and privacy first aspect being at odds with sort of the open source systems? I kind of want to, continue down that line for a bit, because I think it is really interesting and a question that, Chris, you kind of spoke to a bit when you talked about the conflict even within crypto around some of these things.
Right. So if you look at so decentralization in my definition is open systems and permissionless systems where one can easily track what's happening and thereby, building systems that can use this data and improve people's lives. Right. So privacy and decentralization may not go hand in hand. That's my take. Again, privacy is a bigger topic, but I'm talking about, if transactions or if the activity is private, that prohibits people from innovating on it, right? That's really the thread. And I know Tor might disagree with me, but it's a topic of discussion that I love to go deeper.
Just because I unmuted doesn't mean I'm going to immediately disagree with you.
Just some benign unmuting over there.
Yeah, it's truly benign. Now, I do think, and again, I understand your perspective. I just think that we're being kind of presented with a false choice in that regard, because when we say open and permissionless being the definition of decentralization, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be not private, because there's a difference between total openness and permissionlessness in that sense, that anybody can use it, anybody can connect to it, and then the type of open system where all data is accessible to everyone by default, because that's not the type of accountability that we even expect from our Web 2 systems. We do expect some degree of access control. We expect to be able to build applications where if we want to share something with our doctor, we're not automatically sharing it with our neighbor. It's just not a choice that I think, and I think actually it comes down to semantics, because the word open and the word private, they can mean different things depending on the context in which they're used. Like permissionless, I'm always very clear to say permissionless versus permissioned chains, never a public versus a private blockchain, because I think it comes down to who has access, who can read, who can write, etc. And private just means, can we protect the privacy of the data being used? And there's definitely a ton of instances where you want to be interacting with like a known counterparty and you want to have auditable code, but you want to have private data. That's something that you need to be able to program into a permissionless system. And a truly public by default permissionless system, you don't have that degree of programmability and control. And ultimately who gets hurt is the users. I actually think perfectly open, perfectly public systems are at far greater risk of re-centralization than systems that give that degree of data privacy control either to the user or the developer.
Yeah, and speaking about, sorry, go ahead.
Could you clarify that a bit? Like, I'm confused as to whether you're arguing for permissionless systems with privacy features or permission systems.
It's definitely the former.
Okay, all right.
And so we talked a little bit at the outset too here about Tor, you spoke about how legislation kind of is working hand in hand in an interesting way in terms of privacy being the case. And I think we see that in terms of GDPR is maybe the most prominent one. China also recently passed a data privacy law that went into effect, and it was really interesting to see happen. But I know, for example, some companies in the US are holding up data security requirements as required by GDPR to push back against some data requests from the US government. And I think that's really interesting in regards to other countries' legislation and data privacy legislation being used to counteract some of the national security inclinations, let's say, of the United States, for example. But I think that the states themselves are going to be playing a really interesting role here. And as we talk about the importance of privacy, maybe the incentive that aligns with the least in some ways is countries, right? Like companies have an incentive to keep data private because there's liability stuff involved. There's other things like that, but countries really do want to gather, a lot of information on the citizens, a lot of information about other people. It's intelligence, it's information. And so, we see states building out things like CBDCs, social credit systems in China in some ways. And then, on the other hand, we have decentralized protocols being built out that are kind of beyond states or things like that. Do you think there are various systems? Like I know, for example, that some countries that are looking at CBDCs are thinking about ways to incorporate zero-knowledge proofs into those. We have other countries that are not really looking for them to be privacy enhancing or things like that. And hello, Kat, always a good visit. But I'm curious about how you see states entering into these sort of, not only cryptographic developments, but just these variety of systems that we're seeing built out. And if there is one that you think states are going to be interacting more robustly than another way, let's say decentralized protocols versus CBDCs versus something else.
I'm personally not optimistic. So all the central banks, to my knowledge, that have looked at something like zero knowledge, or even not forgetting about the technical details, just have looked at the idea of incorporating true privacy into a CBDC have decided not to, or at least that seems to be the way they're going. There'll often be someone in the bank writing papers about why this is important, why privacy is important, but it's so powerful, the pressure for a government to gather the data is so overwhelming. So CBDCs are like the most attractive thing for governments on the planet for every branch. So Treasury departments would love real-time, perfect economic information about the economy. It's like game-changing for economists. And then any tax collection agency, of course, wants the transparency, and law enforcement wants it. And it's very easy to pitch to the population for, you can eradicate terrorism and child pornography and all this terrible stuff. So it's very hard for me to see a government launching a CBDC and building in privacy. Maybe not impossible, but I'm not optimistic that we'll see that generally. So I think here's my most optimistic case, which is not great. It's that mostly when I talked about privacy earlier, that legislated kind, there's probably a backdoor for the government. In all of that. And that's probably what 99% of the world is using most of the time. And I hope that within the crypto world, we build alternatives for the people who really need it. And I'm not optimistic that we're going to get most of the world to use the alternatives, because almost definitionally, they'll be a little bit worse UX-wise. However good a job the devs do, it might get really close, but it's unlikely to be quite as good. And that means that most of the world will use the one that gives the government the backdoor. But for me, what I care about is that the tools at least exist for that 1%. And when you think about it in terms of like people using privacy tools, most are not that easy to use. Most are not that good. I think maybe the best counterexample would be like the Signal messaging app, which as far as I know is P2P encrypted and not backdoored. And that we're seeing usage grow, although it's still a tiny percentage of other messaging apps. But for other things like Tor is not trivial to use, and its security itself is a little bit in question, and it's a volunteer team lacking resources. For anything else, I mean, people VPN, but they don't really know what they're doing. They don't know if they're doing it securely. So I think, actually, to use a direct crypto example, I'll sometimes talk to Bitcoiners, including like core devs, and they'll say, oh, no, well, we can anonymize our Bitcoin transactions. We know how. And if you dig into it, I don't even know if they're right that they can, but it requires a comp sci degree, right? The level of complexity to do a lot of, to make use of a lot of privacy tools is just not a consumer friendly product. So I think part of it is if we can put things like a better version of Tor, obviously this is a conference for Orchid and Handshake. So we've got developers here who are working on exactly this kind of thing. But basically putting that in a consumer wrapper, I don't think we get 90% of the world using it, but if the people who need it can use it, that's a huge win.
Yeah, Chris, from the dev perspective, I'm curious to get your thoughts on some of what Ari's talking about, because I recognize that these are all technical challenges, and I'm kind of the thought process where it's like it's okay to go slow and iterate slowly. Like we're not going to just fix everything in one day, but in terms of incorporating privacy into very functional models and actors, I'd be curious to hear how you kind of approach those things.
So, I mean, privacy is a challenge, especially on say, like the P2P layer. Like, if you're in China and you want to get outside the Great Wall, I mean, the deep packet inspection that they do, it's going to identify like a Bitcoin connection or a handshake connection, and it's there are certain ways to make it private, to actually make to do like a crypto handshake and use some kind of like pseudo steganographic encoding for the key exchange, like an alligator or something, and in that sense, your connection would be indistinguishable from random bytes. But at the end of the day, it's still possible for anyone to identify you. I think you can't live in an ideal world with at least that sort of thing with like P2P connections. You have to accept that nothing's going to be perfect. You can't make it perfect, but you can make it harder for your attacker to identify you. Yeah, I mean that's like a very technical implementation detail that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the challenge of it, right? And that's why we have these sorts of tiers of privacy that people engage with, where as you were saying, like some people use a VPN, but you don't really understand exactly what the VPN's doing or how, like, what their monetization model is for something else, which goes back to how data is sort of gathered and then sometimes used for a wide variety of purposes that are not clearly disclosed. And so thinking about this too, obviously the name of this session is sort of free fall or free for all, and it comes back to an idea I think is really important about. We talk about the obstacles to more private systems in terms of usability, in terms of just accessibility. And my friend always reminds me of this, and I really appreciate it as I'm telling him about some crypto stuff. He's like, what about like somebody working 2 jobs and like trying to take care of a family? Like we only have so much mental space to do. And so it makes me worry in some ways that privacy is just going to become something that's for people that have the time, the interest, and the money to achieve it. And I'm curious to kind of get you all's thoughts to that. Like, how do you break down the barriers to these, not just systems, but also get people to spend time on it? Because I think there is a real risk that the people with the highest levels of privacy are those that have the money to achieve it. And I look and think about this maybe in terms of like iOS versus Android and the cost of those phones and security and openness of those systems and how tricky that can be. Granted, you're in a walled garden either way, but.
And this isn't a risk. It already happened. It would be completely unfair to be like, we're at risk of ending up in this. Like, that's where we're starting from. The question is if there's any coming back from it. Like, can we reintroduce privacy as an accessible good versus a luxury good? Mm-hmm. And I do agree when we say, like, we can't get people most likely to care about privacy first and foremost. But here, extending on what JJ said, like, here's what I am most worried about. We've got people within the crypto space. There's 2 kinds, I believe, of sort of toxic mindsets within the crypto space. One is like the extractive mindset of like, how much can I take out of this system versus how much can I provide into it? How much value can I be creating with it? And there's plenty of people in the crypto space who have brought an extractive mindset because they come from those kinds of worlds, and they're easy to find. It doesn't mean that they lose. Often they win, but that's a toxic mindset. Another one is what JJ was getting to around like perfect being the enemy of good in some of these systems. Like, to what extent are we willing to accept imperfect systems that are still better at preserving privacy? Like, they've made an okay trade-off between the cost of privacy and the amount of privacy protections that you will get. If we wait for absolutely perfect systems, not only are they likely to be legislated out of existence, but they could be many, many years away from a research and development standpoint. And the costs could ultimately price out anybody in the market who isn't either, as you said, a CS PhD, or who has enough money to spend to solve those problems the perfect way. And if we wait for that perfection, then what we do is we leave time for all the imperfect public by default systems to come in and dominate at the consumer level. And that is not a risk that I think we on this panel as builders should be willing to take, is that we move too slowly, we move too perfectly, and by the time we get what we want to market, there's already been an acceptance that the Web3 world is going to be public by default. That was always the way it was going to be. There was no other way. And we end up with exactly the same extractive systems that we had in Web2, except, as Ari was pointing out, that maybe they're going to be even better at surveilling us and even more extractive. That to me is a far greater risk than implementing some sort of imperfect private system in production.
Greg, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
Oh, I just wanted to build on that. Like, yeah, I thought that was a good point. Like, it's possible if you have perfect privacy, yeah, you are just going to get regulated out of existence. I've noticed more and more a lot of privacy coins are being delisted from exchanges.
Yeah.
And that's just like, I mean, there's nothing you can do about it, right? Like the exchanges aren't gonna take a stand against that. Like, why would they care? And there's really not a way to fight against it. Like, regulators are going to come for that stuff. So it's like, I don't know. It's kind of like if you want a system that's not going to be made illegal by regulators, it's like all the data basically has to be public, which is really strange. And I also agree that there's always going to be a trade-off between privacy and convenience, right? Like, it's unlikely that most people in the world would want to use something like Mimblewimble or Grin or something just because it's too weird, right? There's no out-of-band transactions. To make a transaction with somebody, you actually have to connect to them because you're basically like creating a key together. And I mean, people are not going to like that, right? It's like ordinary people are not going to like that. It's hard enough to use Bitcoin with an actual local wallet. Most people are using Coinbase, but a lot of people can figure out the local wallet thing. Imagine if the other person had to be online in order for you to send them money, but that's what was necessary for privacy in that protocol. So there's always going to be that trade-off between privacy and convenience, and it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of people on board with that.
I'm actually weirdly a little optimistic, just looking at our history.
Always welcome. I love it.
No, just looking at our history of tool adoption, right? When the internet really came about, the idea of downloading a web browser and looking at this weird interface in an era where you had fat software sitting and providing you a far greater user experience, right? So, I mean, people did adopt internet because the convenience of an open system, the value of an open system was even though it wasn't very clear, but somehow it was perceived as valuable, and I think like we're kind of seeing a pattern in with traditional like Web2 systems where I'm seeing quite a bit of anti-Facebook, big tech, creeping into the mainstream. I mean, my mom is concerned about Facebook and Facebook prying on us, right? So that's an indication that we are. Privacy, the infringement of privacy is becoming a lot more mainstream. I think it's only time that will, eventually, make privacy a lot more valuable. You see something like Signal. Signal is a great privacy first messenger, but it's also a messenger, right? So the value proposition is just not purely privacy, but it's private messages. And that's really, I think, where the ball is, right? We can build applications that have privacy as a core primitive and build value on top of that to achieve, whatever function you need to achieve. The fact that, networks like Secret, the fact that we right here, looks like Orchid right here, are so hyper focused on privacy, and we're well funded, and give a sense of ownership back to the user. I think that's going to be a key driver for any level of adoption we're going to see for privacy first tooling. So yes, it's scary. And if you look at like CDBC, like if you look at countries like India doesn't care about CDBC. They have their own payment system they implemented recently, right? It's a fully centralized, fully trackable, fully actually easy to use, but it's completely controlled by the government, right? So I don't know whether CDBC, from an adoption standpoint, is such a critical element for governments to consider. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think we're seeing it going in the opposite direction. But end of the day, I think privacy as a core value can be spread if we consider privacy as a secondary value in the products we're shipping. But it's just some rambling right there.
No, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting when we talk about this. We've spoken on this panel a little bit about sort of just having these tools available for that small percentage of people who really want to use them. And I think about this in terms of privacy coins being delisted or anonymity enhancing currencies, as some of them prefer to be called in a variety of instances. But it's really, I think about it in terms of the increase in the anonymity set in some ways, right? If only a small group of people are using these really private products and services and stuff like that, I think, you can continue to get kind of the barking that, the only people that care about privacy are criminals. For example, if you have a small percentage of people that are using it, it makes it easier to kind of hopefully legislate that perfect privacy thing out of existence. Particularly, we see this, around encryption battles and sexual explicit content in a lot of different instances. So those are some of the concerns I have in terms of, and why I think that the mass adoption effect is really important, because otherwise there's still a messaging and narrative battle that's going to be a huge, huge challenge. And so we've talked about Facebook a few different times on this panel, and I'm conscious about the time we have left, but I want to bring up Meta and the idea of the metaverse and how that has become this whole thing that everybody from Microsoft to Meta to everybody's putting out, and how that as a part of Web3 too functions into conversations around privacy. Because I do think there's a real risk that as people become more immersed in these systems, and I've seen a lot of enthusiasm both kind of in crypto and outside of crypto about the possibilities here. To me, it seems like it's a ripe opportunity to immerse yourself in a pool of data that continuously be gathered. So in terms of setting out sort of protections about that, or thinkings or things that people need to be considering as the metaverse continues to be developed, I just want to get reactions in terms of how you all might be thinking about integrating privacy as this sort of nebulous thing is coming down the pipeline and we have yet to see it in full action.
A lot of different angles to take that. I'll pick one. So digital identity, people, just the idea of whether it's a pseudonym, but verifying identity is a focal point in crypto, obviously, with everything from WorldCoin with, orbs to scan 1 billion eyeballs to Twitter verification and now verifying NFTs. People, I think generally just society outside of crypto are becoming more comfortable with the idea of avatars. I mean, basically younger millennials, Gen Z, who have an identity in Roblox or on some online gaming community, that's now kind of culturally mainstream, this idea of having a, pseudonymous avatar. Lots of projects obviously building things like Web of Trust and different ways of credit scoring or identification without having to reveal your identity or AML KYC. I optimistically, that's where the world's headed. So hopefully in a metaverse, it's not that no data is collected about you or that you have total privacy, but maybe you can at least hopefully hide behind that pseudo-anonymous digital identity with easy VPN tools, easy Tor type tools, Orchid, Handshake, tools to interact online and basically select your level of disclosure. And I think that actually mirrors how we go about day-to-day life. So when you meet someone, you're kind of choosing what information about yourself to volunteer, how to present yourself. Do you wear a name tag? Do you, even how you're dressed? Do you wear your business clothes if you're going out to, a fast food place, something like that? So I think we're used to choosing what we present about ourselves to the world. I'm hoping that consumer behavior will get replicated in the metaverse.
I feel like this is where, as like maybe the only NFT maximalist on this panel, at least in what NFTs could represent, not what they currently represent, but just like there is a clear demand for people to want to express their identity in the metaverse. People want to be able to identify with something, and to pick on the word that Greg was saying, like my favorite word, ownership. Privacy is inherent to the idea of ownership. Can we really own our avatar, our identity in the metaverse if it's public to everyone, if we have no choice about with whom it's shared or how, if we have no choice about which selection of our identity is shared, like if I can't even choose between my profile pictures on Twitter, if they only integrate like ETH-based NFTs, and I'm forced by default to express my identity to everybody equally, or let's say there's a portion of my identity that could actually be politically sensitive to express within the metaverse, but now it must be made public by default. Am I not allowed to express that portion of my identity? Is that a means of restricting metaverse freedom if we're forced into these public by default systems? And I actually think that NFTs have completely redefined how people are thinking about identity, ownership, and privacy in the metaverse. Whereas in DeFi, it was always easy to get back to the idea of it's privacy, it's finance, therefore it's terrorism and money laundering. We can push it to the side, we can ignore it, and we end up with these perfect surveillance CBDCs. In the metaverse, now that people have an expectation that Web3 technologies can be used for something as substantial as developing and expressing identity, they realize that compromising that privacy, compromising that ability to share something with somebody that you trust, that you can share a secret to, and not somebody else, not because it's something bad, but because it's just something you didn't choose to share. We feel that so much more concretely when it comes to an NFT or an expression of ourself, less so when we're just kind of like passively tweeting our bank account every time we interact with Uniswap or Compound or what have you. So I actually think that this is a tremendous good, that we're talking about the metaverse versus strictly DeFi and other Web3 applications that are financially focused. This is actually what's given me the most hope that we're going to end up in the metaverse that we want, because people looked at Mark handing us the metaverse and they said, no way, dude.
I agree. I think Mark introducing the metaverse is the best thing that happened to metaverse.
In a weird way, but yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's a weird challenge because it definitely preceded, him presenting it as this new thing, right? It's been here in some ways, but JJ, what do you got?
Oh, I just wanted to clarify. We're talking about the creepy video that Mark Zuckerberg put out.
Oh yeah, where he's literally handing you the metaverse. I took a still from that video. I put it in my Lisbon presentation. It's basically him giving you the metaverse while he simultaneously sucks up what remains of your liquid data.
Yeah, I can only hope that never happens.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting because we have projects like Decentraland, we have other spaces that are trying to build this out in an interesting way. And then I just know that, since Facebook's done that rebrand to Meta and they've been talking about it, you've seen Microsoft come out with like an enterprise version of the metaverse. And I worry about this too, as like crypto becomes more mainstream in a lot of ways, right? Like you have people piling in and really getting excited about NFTs for a variety of instances. I'm not one of them, but that's okay. And also doing a lot more trading and stuff. And it's getting this sort of mainstream purchase. And I worry about some of the centralization once you have these large, kind of conglomerates jumping into the space as well, right? Like you saw Facebook, Diem, I guess, that was kind of pushed, and then legislators pushed back really hard on that. And, we talked about the kind of inner fights and tribal warfare within crypto about levels of decentralization, being extractive and not really feeding back into the system. And I think that's only going to get exacerbated as these two worlds come more and more together. And to me, I guess the metaverse seems like the prime opportunity or, place that's going to happen as you have money being put into it. And, I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these social media companies coming out with their own versions of NFTs, at the very least. So that's kind of why I was just like thinking about it, because it's on the tip of a lot of people's tongues. It's in a lot of marketing materials as well. And it seems to be kind of the next horizon outside of maybe the physical world and how people choose to interact with it and what they share.
I think it's likely.
I'm actually very optimistic. This is not the first time a centralized company tried to put claim to an open system. Microsoft in the 90s tried to put claim to the internet. AOL tried to put claim by actually developing tools for the internet, but ultimately an open system won. So the composability of an open system will ultimately be the winner.
Yeah, I'd like to say, I mean, if we're just talking about virtual spaces in general as a general concept and not the metaverse, I mean, it's one thing if it's something, like a virtual space like Decentraland or something. It's another thing entirely if it's a multinational billion-dollar corporation that's known for harvesting everybody's data. That's probably not a good thing, and it's probably not a good thing if some major centralized service wins that battle.
Yeah. And on that optimistic note, I want to kind of wind us down. I know we're at time, but Greg, Ari, Tor, JJ, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And stay tuned to Priv8. Up next, we're going to talk more private systems by design. I won't be here, but I'll be watching.